He was the man no one noticed, the quiet figure pushing a mop through empty hallways before the city ever stirred. To coworkers, he was invisible. To executives, furniture. To himself, routine was survival. But on one ordinary morning, when screeching tires and a wall of fire split the silence, everything changed. In that instant, the janitor faced the question no one else dared to answer: step back into safety or step forward into the flames. What he chose would shatter his anonymity forever and bind his life to a name he never expected to know. Would you have done the same? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story. It'll be released soon. The day began long before the city truly woke. Before alarms buzzed across apartment blocks and traffic thickened on the streets, in the quiet hours, when darkness still lingered and the glow of street lamps painted long shadows, he was already at work. The janitor moved through the hushed hallways with a practiced rhythm, mop in hand, cart rolling softly beside him. Each motion precise from years of repetition. His was a presence most people never noticed, a figure that blended into the background. Part of the machinery of everyday life rather than a person with a name and history. Yet without him, the place would grind slowly toward disorder floors, sticky with yesterday's spills. Bins overflowing, restrooms abandoned to neglect. He knew this, even if few others did. The building itself, a glass and steel office tower, seemed asleep in those early hours. Elevators stood motionless, their doors reflecting faint emergency lights. Rows of cubicles sat in silence, screens black, chairs empty, air carrying only the scent of cleaning chemicals and the faint hum of ventilation. He had walked these halls for nearly a decade, long enough to memorize every stain in the carpet, every crack in the tile, every spot where the paint had begun to peel. The familiarity was not comforting, but it was steady. Each day mirrored the one before. Routine was his anchor. He rarely encountered others at that time. Security guards offered brief nods at the start of his shift, but conversations seldom followed. Sometimes an early executive arrived, briefcase in hand, their eyes sliding past him as though he were part of the furniture. He did not resent it anymore. Invisibility had become second nature. Once, years ago, he had tried to spark small exchanges, hoping for recognition, even just a smile. But responses were fleeting, distracted, as though acknowledging him disrupted some unspoken order. Eventually, he learned silence was easier. At home, life was no less quiet. He lived alone in a modest apartment. Walls lined with fading photographs and secondhand furniture that bore the weight of years. A small television filled the evenings, its light washing over him as he prepared simple meals. Calls from relatives were rare, visits rarer still. He was neither bitter nor content about this distance. It was simply how things were. People drifted, connections thinned. Work filled the spaces left behind. There were times when he reflected on what had brought him here. As a younger man, he had imagined something different, perhaps a trade, perhaps steady advancement somewhere beyond the cleaning cart and bucket. But opportunities had slipped past him, lost in a haze of obligations, mistakes, and moments when luck never quite seemed to turn in his favor. He had come to accept the janitor's life not as failure, but as necessity. The paycheck was small, yet it was honest. And honesty mattered. Each morning, he dressed carefully in his uniform, smoothing the shirt, tying the laces on worn shoes, pocketing the small notebook where he scribbled reminders. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, not for others to see, but for himself. No one could take away the pride he found in doing his work thoroughly, even if it went unremarked. The floors he left shining, the windows cleared of smudges, the faint scent of polish lingering in the air, these were his silent signatures. The city outside bustled, awake as the hours passed. Light filtered through tall windows, painting the lobby in pale gold. Soon, the first waves of employees would arrive, shuffling in with coffee cups and tired expressions, talking over phones or scrolling through emails before even sitting down. By then, he would be finished, slipping out through the side door, just as unnoticed as when he came. His shift ended where theirs began. The overlap brief enough that he remained little more than a shadow passing through. He had grown used to this invisibility, almost comfortable with it, but in quiet moments, he sometimes wondered if life had more waiting. A stray thought might linger as he leaned on the mop handle, staring at his reflection in a darkened window, whether anyone would remember him if he stopped showing up, whether the small imprint he left each day meant anything beyond clean floors and empty bins. The questions never found answers, and eventually he would turn back to his work. Pushing thoughts aside with the same ease, he pushed his cart down the hall. No one in that building imagined that the man scrubbing restrooms and polishing brass fixtures carried inside him a capacity for decisive, selfless action. They saw only the uniform, the bowed head, the quiet footsteps. Yet beneath the layers of routine and invisibility was someone who noticed more than most, who had learned to measure life in details others ignored. And in the days to come, those unnoticed details, the patience, the resilience, quiet readiness, would surface in a moment of fire and smoke when invisibility would no longer be possible. For now, though, he remained what he had always been, a man hidden within the routine, his story waiting unrecognized. In the margins of ordinary life, he had not always imagined himself walking corridors with a mop and bucket. There was a time, years earlier, when the idea of laboring unseen had felt like a punishment reserved for others, not for him. As a boy, he had been restless, curious, his mind always pulling toward possibility. Teachers often remarked on his quick grasp of things, but in the same breath they warned that he lacked focus. His energy would scatter unless he learned discipline. Discipline never came easily. Instead, life pressed in with demands he could not ignore. By the time he was out of school, there was no room for college or apprenticeships. His father had fallen ill, his mother already exhausted from double shifts at a diner, and he became the one who filled in the gaps. Work was work, whether it was cleaning, hauling, or repairing. Dreams gave way to necessity. He married young, perhaps too young, swept along by love and urgency. His wife had believed in his potential, telling him he was meant for more than the odd jobs that kept them afloat. For a while, that faith kept him striving. He picked up certifications, tried night courses, applied for dozens of positions that promised advancement. Each rejection letter chipped away at him until he stopped telling her about them. When their first child arrived, his attention shifted entirely. What mattered then was food on the table, rent paid on time, doctor's visits covered. Ambition turned into endurance. Years passed and a blur of shifts stacked one on another. When his wife's health began to fail, it was his turn to take on the weight she could no longer bear. He juggled work with caretaking, managing prescriptions and hospital visits while still clocking in before dawn. Her decline was slow, but steady, and when she was finally gone, he found himself standing in the same apartment, surrounded by the same furniture. But with silence so heavy it felt like another occupant. His children had already grown by then, each carving their own lives elsewhere, visiting when they could. He encouraged them not to look back, not to feel tethered to his struggles. Better that they see the world than stay trapped in the cycle that had held him. The years of being underestimated had taught him something he rarely voiced: that society often measured a man's worth in ways that missed the truth entirely. Titles, paychecks, the number of people who knew your name, these were the markers most clung to. His life had offered none of that. He was introduced, if at all, by his role: the janitor, the cleaner, the guy who handles the floors. But when the office emptied and he moved through the stillness alone, he felt a different perspective take shape. He knew what it was to keep going when no one cheered, two shoulder burdens without applause. To carve dignity out of small acts no one noticed. There were moments that stung, of course. Like the time he overheard two executives laughing about how people in his position must have made bad choices, as though their clean shoes and pressed suits were proof of better judgment. Or the time a younger employee, no older than his grandson, scolded him for leaving a streak on a window without realizing he had already planned to polish it again. He absorbed those moments quietly, not because they didn't hurt, but because he had learned that responding would change nothing. Resentment was a heavy thing, and he refused to carry more weight than he already bore. Yet beneath the quiet exterior, there was resilience hardened by years of labor. Every setback had forced him to bend but not break. He had grown familiar with rejection, with invisibility, with being passed over. But he also knew he could survive what others could not. Long hours did not crush him. They became a kind of rhythm. Loneliness did not defeat him. It sharpened his awareness. Being underestimated no longer surprised him. It simply became one more layer of armor. Those who glimpsed him briefly in the hallways could never have known the full span of that. History, the loved ones he had buried, the children he had raised, the countless small sacrifices that kept him moving forward. To them, he was the man behind the mop, someone easily dismissed. But within him, the years had built a quiet endurance, a strength unmeasured by recognition. And it was that strength, unnoticed and uncelebrated, that waited in the background of his life, ready to rise when the world finally demanded more of him than routine. The morning had slipped by in its usual rhythm. Floors polished, waste bins emptied, restrooms scrubbed until the harsh scent of cleaner replaced the stale air of yesterday. When his cart was returned to its closet and the lights above the lobby glowed bright enough to welcome the arriving staff, he signed out quietly and left through the side door. Another shift done, another day of invisible labor behind him. Outside, the city was stretching awake in full daylight. Cars crowded the streets, horns punctuating the hum of movement, and the sidewalks swelled with commuters. He pulled his jacket tight against a lingering breeze and started toward the bus stop he used every day. It was a familiar walk, a path that had carried him home hundreds of times. Past the corner cafe that released the smell of burnt espresso into the air. Past the newspaper stand where the vendor nodded without ever remembering his name. Past the mural painted years ago that had begun to peel with time. His route was not glamorous, but it was dependable, a thread of routine woven through his life. He carried the same worn backpack slung over one shoulder, inside it a thermos, a folded newspaper, and the battered novel he chipped away at in snatches of free time. The sky was clear, the sun rising higher with a sharp brightness that reflected off glass windows and windshields alike. He was tired, but not unpleasantly so, the kind of fatigue that followed a job done thoroughly. He thought about the small meal he would cook when he returned home, maybe eggs with toast, and how he might stretch his legs later with a short walk in the park nearby. These were modest plans, but they grounded him. He reached the intersection where traffic always snarled, and the wait for the pedestrian light seemed endless. He pressed the button, slipped his hands into his pockets, and glanced at the line of cars caught in the jam. Engines idled impatiently. A delivery truck rumbled as the driver tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. A family van crawled forward inch by inch. Somewhere, a horn blared long and sharp, though there was nowhere for anyone to move. He watched absent-mindedly, the way one does when stuck in the lull between destinations. But then a sound cut through the ordinary clamor, different from the rest. It was sharper, more violent, the screech of tires losing grip. His head turned instinctively, eyes narrowing toward the bend in the road a short distance away. In a blur of motion, a car appeared, swerving unnaturally, its back end fishtailing as the driver fought for control. The squeal of rubber on asphalt was followed by the sickening slam of metal striking a barrier. The impact echoed across the intersection, jolting pedestrians and drivers alike into a stunned silence. For a moment, everything seemed suspended, sound draining into a hollow stillness. Then the smoke began to rise, dark and curling from the crumpled hood of the vehicle. Carrying with it the acrid scent of burning oil, the janitor stood rooted to the spot. His breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. Around him, people gasped, some covering their mouths, others fumbling for phones. A woman screamed faintly, and a man near the curb muttered something under his breath, but no one moved closer. The traffic, locked in place, became a frozen tableau of faces staring wide-eyed through windshields. The world had shifted in the span of seconds, an ordinary morning splitting into something darker. Heavier, he felt unease settle into him, a sensation prickling beneath his skin. This was no minor accident where drivers stepped out to exchange words and insurance. The car twisted against the barrier, hissed with heat. Flames flickered near the underside, small at first but undeniable. The driver's silhouette inside was slumped, motionless, pinned by the warped doorframe. The danger was clear, yet hesitation rippled through the crowd. Everyone waiting for someone else to act. He gripped the strap of his backpack tightly, pulse quickening. Years of routine, of fading into the background, had never prepared him for this kind of moment, yet he felt a pull he could not explain. The bus he usually caught had just turned onto the street, but he hardly noticed. His gaze was fixed on the wreckage ahead, on the smoke climbing higher. Something inside told him that in another few minutes, hesitation would turn into tragedy. And standing there, unnoticed as always, he realized the day was no longer ordinary. The path he had walked 1,000 times had carried him into a crossroads that would change everything. The sound tore through the air, so suddenly that it seemed to rip the morning apart. First came the shrill cry of tires scraping desperately against asphalt, a noise that raised the hairs on the back of every neck within earshot. It was not the squeak of a casual stop at a light, nor the grind of brakes pressed too late at a traffic signal. It was the sound of something wrong, of momentum gone out of control. Heads turned instinctively toward the bend in the road just as the car came into view. Skidding sideways in a blur of smoke and sunlight glinting off glass, the impact followed in a sickening instant. The metal frame of the vehicle colliding with the barrier in a shuddering crash. The echo rattled across the intersection, a hollow boom that silenced conversations and drew startled gasps from bystanders. Shards of glass sprayed outward like scattered diamonds, catching the light before raining down across the pavement. For a moment, it was as though the city itself held its breath. The car jerked to a halt, tilted unnaturally against the concrete divider, its hood crumpled like paper. The janitor froze where he stood, one foot still on the curb. His breath caught in his chest as he tried to process the scene before him. Around him, people shifted, uncertain. A man holding a coffee cup spilled its contents down his shirt but did not seem to notice. A young woman raised her phone, fumbling to capture video as though the glow of the screen could make sense of the chaos. Drivers trapped in the jam leaned out of windows, craning their necks. Honking horns that now sounded strangely hollow against the silence that had settled. Smoke began to rise in faint curls from beneath the twisted hood, darkening with each passing second. The smell reached him quickly: burnt oil, rubber, something sharp that stung the back of his throat. It carried the unmistakable warning of fire. He saw the driver's figure inside, slumped against the seat, unmoving. No door opened, no window rolled down. Whoever was trapped in there was not coming out on their own. His pulse thudded in his ears, matching the uneven sputter of the engine. Fear pressed against him, heavy and rational. He had no training for this, no protective gear, nothing but the jacket on his back and the instinct to survive like everyone else. His mind screamed that it was too dangerous, that the car could ignite at any moment, that stepping forward might mean not stepping back again. He glanced around, searching for someone more qualified, someone braver, someone in uniform who would know what to do. But the seconds stretched, and no one moved. People lingered at the edges of safety, forming a hesitant half-circle around the wreckage. They whispered to one another, their voices carrying fragments of fear. Is anyone calling 911? It might explode. Somebody needs to do something. But still, no feet crossed the invisible boundary that separated them from the danger. The crowd stood suspended between urgency and paralysis. Waiting for action to arrive from elsewhere, the janitor felt the weight of that waiting settle on his shoulders. For years he had been invisible, the man who cleaned up after others, who passed unnoticed in the hallways of glass offices. Now, in the middle of a city intersection, all those eyes were turned toward the wreck, each pair silently pleading for someone else to take the first step. He realized in a rush of clarity that he was standing in the same paralysis, one more figure frozen by fear. His heart pounded harder. But beneath the fear was another current, an insistent voice that told him he could not keep standing still. The flames at the edge of the hood licked higher, flickers of orange against the smoke. Time was collapsing. He tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack, fingers trembling, breath shallow. Instinct warred with caution, the survival urge pulling one way, a deeper sense of obligation pulling the other. He thought fleetingly of his children, of the years spent teaching them that strength was not in words but in choices. He thought of his wife. He's gone now, but once insistent that he had more courage than he believed. Another pop erupted from the car's front, a metallic groan that sent the crowd staggering back a step. That was when he knew the moment of hesitation had ended. He could no longer wait for someone else. Whether out of fear or bravery or some mixture of both, his legs began to move, carrying him off the curb toward the smoke. The air felt hotter with each step, the roar of his heartbeat louder than the voices behind him. He was no longer just the janitor in the background. In that instant, he was the one person choosing to act while others remained frozen. The choice would shape everything that followed. The first step toward the wreck felt heavier than any he had taken before. The crowd behind him seemed to dissolve into a blur of color and sound, their voices fading until all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat and the angry hiss of the damaged car. The air grew hotter as he drew closer, the smoke thickening, curling upward in dark ribbons that carried the acrid stench of burning oil and scorched rubber. His lungs protested with each breath, but he pressed forward, blinking against the sting in his eyes. The figure inside the vehicle remained motionless, head slumped, as though suspended between life and death. That stillness pushed him on. The car groaned as though alive, metal expanding and contracting with the heat. He reached the driver's side, already feeling the waves of heat on his skin, a fierce warning to turn back. The hood hissed violently, small flames licking outward, threatening to spread. He placed his hand on the door handle and immediately recoiled, the metal searing hot against his palm. Instinct urged him to retreat, to wait for help. But the thought of leaving someone trapped inside filled him with a dread more powerful than fear of fire. He pulled his jacket from his shoulders, wrapping the fabric clumsily around his hand, and gripped the handle again. The door resisted, warped by the crash, groaning against his effort. Every second felt like an eternity. The roar of blood in his ears drowned out everything else. He braced one foot against the frame, leaned his weight, and yanked with all the strength he could summon. His muscles screamed, his back ached, but the door remained stubbornly closed. Behind him, he could sense the crowd watching, their collective tension pressing against him like a physical weight. A faint voice called out for him to stop, to wait for the fire department. He ignored it. The flames were growing. Waiting was no longer an option. He shifted tactics, crouching lower, gripping the edge of the door with both hands, and pulled again. The metal screeched, bending slightly, but not enough. His lungs burned as smoke swirled around him, black smudges clinging to his skin and clothes. He coughed violently, eyes watering, yet refused to let go. Another surge of effort, another wrench of the handle. And finally, there was a tearing sound, the twisted frame giving way just enough to crack open. A wave of heat and smoke spilled out, choking him. But he forced himself to reach inside. The driver was young. No older than his own son had once been, unconscious but breathing faintly. The janitor hooked his arm beneath the man's shoulders, his other hand reaching awkwardly for the seatbelt. The buckle jammed, stuck from the impact, and he tugged furiously until it finally released with a snap. His heart pounded harder as he dragged the man upward, the dead weight making every motion sluggish and desperate. The flames had begun to spread across the hood, crackling, their orange light reflecting in the shattered windshield. He leaned back, pulling the man inch by inch out of the seat, his own body trembling from the effort. His jacket slipped, exposing his skin to the searing metal. Pain shot through his hands, sharp and immediate, but he clenched his teeth and refused to let go. The man's legs snagged against the crumpled frame, refusing to slide free. With a final grunt of exertion, he twisted, lifted, and tore the stranger loose. Stumbling backward onto the pavement with the limp body collapsing against him, for a breathless moment, he lay there, chest heaving, eyes blurred by smoke. The roar of the fire behind him grew louder, flames engulfing the engine in a violent whoosh that sent a wave of heat across his back. He scrambled to his feet, dragging the man with him. Each step away from the wreck, feeling like a race against an invisible clock. The crowd finally stirred, rushing forward to help now that he had broken the barrier of fear. Hands reached out, pulling the injured man from his grasp. Voices rose in urgent commands and sirens wailed faintly in the distance. He staggered back, coughing hard, his palms raw and red, his jacket blackened with soot. His legs felt weak, yet there was no mistaking what he had done. The car behind him erupted fully into flame, a column of fire climbing skyward, consuming what might have been the man's tomb. The janitor stood apart, bent over, catching his breath, the sting of smoke still in his lungs, but with a quiet certainty settling into him. He had chosen to move when others froze. He had chosen to step into the fire, and that choice had carried a stranger back into life. The man's weight pressed down on him like a burden far heavier than his frame should have been able to manage. Every muscle in his body screamed as he hooked his arms beneath the stranger's shoulders, dragging him inch by inch across the pavement. The unconscious figure was dead weight, limbs limp and uncooperative, his head lolling against the janitor's chest. Smoke coiled in heavy waves around them, biting at his throat and filling his lungs with fire. Each breath burned, shallow and ragged, but he could not afford to stop. Behind him, the car hissed louder, a sinister reminder that time was running out. His shoes scraped against the ground as he dug in, using every ounce of strength left in him to haul the man away from the wreck. The soles slipped once on the sheen of leaked fluid spread across the asphalt, and for a terrifying instant he nearly fell backward, the weight of the stranger threatening to crush them both to the ground. But sheer will pushed him forward, teeth clenched, arms trembling, determined not to release his grip. He could feel the faint rise and fall of the stranger's chest against his arm, fragile proof that life still clung to him. That fragile rhythm became his anchor so long as it continued. He would not let go. The crowd, which had held back in paralyzed silence, began to stir. Gasps and shouted fragments of encouragement rose behind him. "Pull him out! Hurry! God, the car's going to blow!" The voices were distant, muffled by the blood roaring in his ears, but they marked a shift. Where there had been stillness, now there was motion. People rushed forward tentatively, some with hands outstretched, though none came close enough to relieve him just yet. Their urgency mirrored his own, but their fear kept them a step away. He did not look back at them. His focus stayed locked on the task at hand. On the dead weight, he was determined to keep alive. He dragged the man a few more feet. The distance between them and the smoking wreckage still far too close. The heat radiated so strongly it seemed to sear the back of his neck. His lungs spasmed with another cough, the taste of ash coating his tongue. The stranger's legs snagged again on the uneven ground, jerking to a halt. For a heartbeat, he thought he might lose his grip. The man's head slipped against his arm, threatening to fall back toward the pavement. With a guttural sound he barely recognized as his own, he heaved upward, shifting the body higher against his chest, and staggered back another step. That was when the flames erupted fully. The hood gave way with a thunderous crack, and fire burst outward in a violent surge. The sound like a roar filling the street. The crowd shrieked and stumbled backward, some covering their faces, others raising their phones instinctively. Heat blasted across the space, and the janitor felt it slam into his back like an open furnace. He bent lower over the man he was carrying, shielding him as best he could, staggering with renewed urgency. The sound of shattering glass rang out as windows blew apart, scattering shards across the pavement. Adrenaline surged through him, burning away fatigue for a moment. His legs pumped, clumsy but relentless, his arms locked tight around the stranger's chest. At last, a pair of hands reached for him from the edge of the crowd, steadying his elbow, helping guide the man away from danger. Another pair of arms reached for the unconscious figure, and reluctantly he let the weight transfer, his hands shaking violently as they released their hold. Paramedics had arrived, rushing in with practiced urgency, their uniforms and equipment cutting through the chaos. He stumbled backward, nearly collapsing under the sudden absence of weight. His chest heaved, lungs desperate for clean air that didn't exist in that smoke-thickened street. He bent forward, coughing hard, palms raw and stinging from the burns, jacket scorched black where it had shielded him. The sirens grew louder now, flashing red and blue against the backdrop of fire, devouring the wrecked car. The sound of a stretcher being wheeled closer cut through the haze as paramedics lifted the injured man onto it with swift precision. For the first time, the janitor allowed himself to look at the stranger's face. The skin was pale, smudged with soot, eyes closed. But his chest still rose and fell beneath the mask. The paramedics pressed against him. Alive. That was enough. Relief washed through him, mixing with the trembling exhaustion that left his knees weak. He straightened slowly, vision swimming, and caught sight of the flames swallowing the car hole. Orange light twisting upward in furious waves. If he had hesitated any longer, even by seconds, the man's body would have been lost in that inferno. The bystanders, who had frozen at first, now crowded the edges, murmuring in awe. Some whispering about his courage, others staring wide-eyed as though they were only now realizing what he had done. But their voices meant little. He stood apart, sweat and soot clinging to his skin. Heart still hammering, knowing only that he had pulled a life free from the fire. The air was alive with noise. Yet within him, there was only a ringing stillness. Sirens wailed as emergency vehicles pushed through the tangled traffic, their lights splashing red and blue across the smoke-darkened sky. The street was crowded now. People who only minutes earlier had frozen in place, now surging forward to witness the aftermath. The paramedics moved quickly, their voices clipped and steady, surrounding the stretcher with a choreography born of training. They lifted the unconscious man with practiced hands, checking vitals, fastening straps, placing an oxygen mask over his soot-streaked face. Every movement seemed urgent, every second measured. But to the janitor, it all unfolded as though through a haze. He stood a few feet away, bent slightly at the waist, drawing in shaky breaths that burned his lungs. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, while ash smudged his cheeks and hair. The smell of smoke had burrowed into his skin, heavy and bitter, a scent he would carry long after the fire burned out. His palms throbbed with a raw sting, the skin reddened and tender where the heat of the metal had seared him. He flexed his fingers once, then let them hang at his sides. The work was finished, the man was alive, and yet he felt no surge of triumph. Only the overwhelming need to step away. The car roared behind him as the fire consumed it entirely. Flames leapt higher, a violent reminder of how close death had been only moments before. Firefighters dragged hoses across the pavement, water hissing as it struck the inferno, steam rising in thick white clouds. The crowd gasped each time glass shattered or metal groaned. But their attention quickly returned to the paramedics working on the rescued man. Phones were raised high, capturing fragments of the scene, their lenses glinting in the flashing lights. Somewhere in that crowd, his figure must have been caught too, a silhouette bent in exhaustion, clothes singed, face streaked. But if they looked, they did not call to him, and he preferred it that way. Someone brushed past him, a woman with wide eyes who muttered a hurried thank you before darting closer to get a better look at the stretcher. A man clapped him once on the shoulder, as if recognizing his part in the rescue, but the janitor barely registered the touch. Praise sat uncomfortably on him, foreign and undesired. He had not moved toward the burning car for recognition, and the thought of being frozen in the gaze of strangers made him uneasy. Already he felt too visible, too exposed. He needed the shadows again, the familiar invisibility where no eyes followed him. He stepped back slowly, each footfall deliberate, careful not to draw attention. The commotion carried on without him, swallowing the space he left behind. Fire hoses roared, voices called out instructions, the stretcher wheels clattered as it was loaded into the waiting ambulance. The crowd pressed closer, filling the gap he had occupied, as though he had never been there at all. He moved toward the edge of the scene, weaving through clusters of people whose faces glowed with awe, relief, or curiosity. None of them turned to stop him. By the time he reached the far curb, the flashing lights were already beginning to blur in the distance. Muffled by the hum of the city resuming its rhythm, he pulled his jacket tighter across his chest, though it was scorched and reeked of smoke. His body felt heavy, every muscle trembling with the memory of strain, yet he carried himself with quiet purpose. He walked away from the chaos, not once glancing back at the inferno or the ambulance doors. Closing on the man he had saved, the bus stop was only a block away, and he headed there instinctively, the same path he had taken countless mornings after work. But today, each step carried a strange dissonance, the routine of his life, brushing against the extraordinary weight of what he had just done. He did not dwell on it. He allowed the noise of the city to fold over him, allowed his figure to blur into the background again. By the time the bus pulled up and he stepped aboard, he was just another tired passenger. His seat blending into rows of strangers who did not know what had happened only streets away. The sirens faded behind him, the flashing lights no longer visible. For those who remained at the scene, he would become a nameless detail. Perhaps mentioned in passing, someone had pulled the man out, some ordinary bystander. But he carried no resentment in that anonymity. It was where he belonged, in the silence after the storm. Moving quietly back into the shadows, his part finished, his name unspoken. Morning arrived with little fanfare. The sun slipped between the blinds of his small apartment, painting thin stripes of light across the worn carpet. He rose slowly, body still aching from the previous day's strain, his hands stiff and tender where the heat had scorched them. When he stood before the bathroom mirror, he hardly recognized the man reflected there. His face was smeared faintly with soot that hadn't washed away completely, his eyes rimmed red from smoke and lack of sleep. He splashed water on his skin and tried not to think too hard about the images that replayed whenever he closed his eyes: the roar of fire, the scream of metal, the weight of the unconscious stranger dragged across the pavement. He told himself he had done what anyone would do. Though he knew deep down that not everyone had moved forward, he dressed as usual, pulling on his work uniform with careful movements, buttoning each button with fingers that still smarted at the touch of fabric. The smell of burnt rubber clung stubbornly to the jacket he had left draped over a chair, a reminder of yesterday's chaos. He left it there, deciding he could not wear it again so soon. Instead, he slipped on an older coat, one with frayed cuffs and a loose thread at the pocket. It was unremarkable, which was what he wanted. On the way to work, he stopped at the corner store, as he often did, to buy a paper and a small cup of coffee. The man behind the counter greeted him with a distracted nod. Eyes already turned toward the small television mounted above the lottery tickets. A morning news broadcast played, the anchor's voice carrying a mixture of practiced calm and sharpened urgency. He caught fragments as he dug into his pockets for coins, words like heroic rescue, downtown accident, and billionaire's son. The phrase made him pause, the coins clinking against the counter. He turned his head toward the screen, his brows knitting together. The news anchor's image was replaced with footage of the burning wreck, flames devouring the car, smoke billowing into the sky. The video was shaky, captured by a bystander's phone, but clear enough to show the chaos he remembered all too well. Then came the headline stretched across the screen: "Son of industrialist survives fiery crash." Beneath it, another line: "Witness credited with pulling victim from wreckage." His heart stuttered at the words. The anchor's voice carried on, naming the man who had been trapped inside: Andrew Whitmore, son of the reclusive billionaire Victor Whitmore, whose empire of factories, shipping lines, and investments stretched across states and oceans. He had seen the name before in business sections, usually paired with stories of acquisitions and wealth that dwarfed imagination. Now it was paired with the face of the young man he had pulled from the car, shown in photographs taken at charity events and corporate functions. The resemblance was unmistakable. Even beneath the soot and unconscious slackness, he remembered. He lowered his coffee slowly, the cup trembling in his burned hand. The chatter in the store seemed to swell as others noticed the story. Two women murmured to each other about the accident, marveling at how close tragedy had come to striking one of the wealthiest families in the country. A man laughed softly, shaking his head, saying it must be good to have that kind of luck. The janitor stood in silence, stunned, his thoughts tumbling. He had not expected this. To him, the man in the car had been only that, a man in need. Not a name tied to wealth, not a headline splashed across newspapers, not the heir to a fortune. The anchor mentioned briefly that a bystander had pulled Andrew from the wreck before the vehicle was engulfed in flames. They called it a remarkable act of bravery, though no name was attached. He felt both relieved and unsettled at the omission. Relieved that his anonymity was preserved, that the world had not yet pinned a spotlight on him. Unsettled, because he knew how fragile that anonymity might be now. Someone had filmed the moment. Someone had likely caught a glimpse of him in the chaos. It was only a matter of time before questions were asked. He folded the newspaper under his arm and left the store quickly, the sound of the television still echoing in his ears. On the bus ride to work, conversations buzzed around him. More people were talking about the crash, about Whitmore's son, about the mysterious rescuer. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching the city slide past, the hum of voices pressing in but never acknowledged. His chest tightened with unease. He had saved a life, yes. But now that life came with shadows and consequences he could not predict. When he arrived at the building where he worked, the security guard at the desk greeted him with a look that lingered longer than usual. Perhaps it was nothing. Or perhaps the man had already seen the news. Already connected a faint resemblance between the suit-streaked figure and the shaky footage and the quiet janitor who walked through those doors each day. He offered no words, only a faint nod, and pushed his cart down the hall as he always did. But inside him, the world had shifted. The man he had carried from fire was not a stranger anymore. He was a Whitmore. A name that opened doors for some and closed them for others. And though the janitor wanted nothing more than to retreat back into the shadows, he understood, with a mix of awe and dread, that his life was now tied to theirs in ways he had never imagined. The knock came late in the evening. At a time when the hallway outside his apartment usually lay quiet, the kind of silence broken only by the hum of pipes and the distant muffled voices from televisions behind closed doors. He had been sitting at his small kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, trying to push the day's unease from his mind. The news of the morning still lingered in him. The headlines about Andrew Whitmore, the footage replayed endlessly on screens in store windows and bus terminals. He had avoided watching more than glimpses, choosing instead to bury himself in routine, scrubbing the same scuffed tiles at work, emptying trash bins as though nothing had changed. But the world outside his control had shifted, and now, with that knock, he felt it pressing at his door. It was a firm knock, not the uncertain tap of a neighbor or the friendly rap of a deliverman. It carried authority, the kind that made his shoulders stiffen before he even rose to his feet. He crossed the narrow room, his bare feet brushing against the worn carpet, and hesitated with his hand on the knob. Through the peephole he saw them, two men in dark suits, polished shoes, expressions unreadable. They stood straight, not shifting their weight or glancing down the hall, as though they had been waiting for this moment with practiced patience. His instinct told him to stay quiet, to let them believe no one was home. But the lights inside were on, and one of the men glanced directly toward the door, as if sensing his presence. A second knock followed, gentler, but no less insistent. Against his better judgment, he opened the door a fraction, the chain still in place. The men introduced themselves calmly, their voices low, identifying themselves as representatives of the Whitmore family. The name alone sent a chill through him, though he kept his face composed. They asked if he would allow them a few minutes of his time. He hesitated. The thought of billionaires and their families reaching into his modest life unsettled him deeply. He had no desire to be paraded as a hero, no interest in standing before cameras or being thanked in some grand gesture meant more for appearances than sincerity. He was wary of motives, of the idea that wealth rarely moved without purpose. He asked what they wanted, his voice steady, though his chest tightened. One of the men replied that the family simply wished to speak with him. To express their gratitude in person, the words hung in the air, polite and rehearsed. Gratitude. It sounded harmless enough, but he could not shake the unease. Gratitude from people like that came with weight, with expectations. And he had spent his life avoiding entanglements that threatened his fragile balance. He told them he wasn't looking for recognition, that what he had done was nothing extraordinary. Anyone, he said, would have acted the same. One of the men's brows lifted slightly, as though amused by his deflection. He replied with a quiet certainty that not everyone had acted. Not everyone had stepped forward when the flames grew high. Reluctantly, the janitor unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. The men remained respectful, never pushing past the threshold. But their presence filled the narrow hallway with a formality that seemed out of place against the peeling paint and flickering light bulb. They handed him a card embossed with the Whitmore name, an address printed beneath. They told him that if he preferred not to be visited again, he could come to them instead, at his own choosing. The father of the man he had saved wished to meet him. They asked for no immediate answer, only that he consider it. He took the card with burned hands, the edges pressing into his skin, and felt the distance between their world and his more acutely than ever. They nodded politely, thanked him once more, and left, their polished shoes clicking down the hallway until the sound faded into silence. He closed the door slowly, sliding the chain back into place, and leaned against the wood, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The card lay heavy in his palm. He set it down on the kitchen table and stared at it as though it might shift on its own. A name embossed in gold, an invitation he had never sought. He thought about ignoring it, about throwing it into the trash and returning to the safety of his anonymity. Yet part of him knew the connection had already been made, that turning away from it would not erase what had happened. He had pulled a man from fire, and now the fire had followed him home in another form. Dressed in tailored suits and polished manners, he sat back down at the table, the tea now cold beside him, and rubbed at the raw skin of his hands. He told himself he wanted nothing from them, no gifts, no attention. Still, the knock at the door echoed in his mind, a reminder that his act could not remain hidden. The shadows he had lived in so comfortably had been disturbed, and though he longed to disappear again, the world of wealth and power had already begun to close the distance. The days that followed felt strangely unfamiliar, as though the streets he had walked for years and the building he had cleaned each morning had been subtly rearranged overnight. His routine remained the same: rise before dawn, slip into the uniform that smelled faintly of disinfectant, push the mop across the same tired floors, but the world around him seemed to look at him differently. The quiet anonymity he had carried for so long had begun to fray. Where once he had passed unnoticed, now eyes lingered. Neighbors who rarely gave him more than a nod leaned across their doorframes when he left his apartment, their voices pitched low, but not low enough. He could hear fragments as he locked his door. "That's him, isn't it? The one from the accident." Some voices carried admiration, others curiosity, but all of them carried attention he had never asked for. On his walk to the bus stop, he caught people glancing at him, their eyes shifting quickly away when he noticed. A pair of teenagers whispered while one pointed out the burned patch on his coat sleeve. A woman at the corner store paused before handing him change, studying his face as though comparing it to the grainy footage replayed on the news. The headlines had multiplied in the papers stacked on the counter: "Hero saves billionaire's son," "Mysterious Good Samaritan vanishes after rescue," each one written as if he were part of a story larger than himself. He found it jarring, almost laughable, to be cast in those words. Hero, mysterious. The truth felt smaller and less polished. A man acting on instinct, afraid but unwilling to stand still. At work, the change was even harder to escape. The security guard, who had once barely looked up from his clipboard, greeted him with a smile too wide to rehearsed, as if they were suddenly old friends. Some employees offered him free cups of coffee, gestures he declined with a stiff shake of his head. Others simply stared as he passed, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. In the break room, he overheard them speculating about his life, piecing together details they did not know. One voice said he must have been a soldier once, the way he pulled the man from the fire. Another insisted he had training, that ordinary people didn't step into flames. He wanted to laugh, to correct them, but he kept his silence. Let them make their stories. He had lived long enough to know people preferred their own versions of the truth. The media was harder to ignore. Reporters had begun to hover outside his apartment building, waiting by the entrance with cameras ready. The first time he saw them, he froze at the sight of the lenses turning toward him, his voices calling questions. Why did you do it? Do you expect a reward from the Whitmore family? He ducked his head and pushed past them, heart pounding, wishing the ground would swallow him whole. By the time he reached the bus stop, his hands were shaking, not from fear of fire, but from the fear of exposure. He had lived a life defined by being unseen, and now, under the harsh light of attention, he felt stripped bare. Even the kindness unsettled him. A neighbor left a note taped to his door, thanking him for his bravery. Another left a casserole dish, as though acts of gratitude could fill the spaces that years of invisibility had left empty. He accepted nothing, not because he was ungrateful, but because it felt undeserved. He had done what needed to be done. To be celebrated for it seemed wrong, like being rewarded for breathing at night. He tried to retreat into the small comforts of his apartment, turning off the television, letting the radio play soft music, holding a book he could barely concentrate on. Yet the sense of being watched lingered even there. The shadows outside his window no longer felt safe. He imagined neighbors still whispering, reporters scribbling, strangers attaching his face to headlines. The attention weighed heavy, like chains clamped around a life that had once been his own. What troubled him most was the suspicion curling in his chest. He wondered if the men in suits had not been wrong when they said his act mattered more than he believed. He wondered what the Whitmore family truly wanted. Gratitude was one thing, but people of such wealth and power rarely moved without reason. And now, caught in this uneasy spotlight, he could not shake the fear that what he had done had marked him for something far larger, far more complicated than a moment of instinct on a smoky street. The silence he once lived in had been broken, and he no longer knew if it could ever be restored. The invitation came with little warning, delivered not by the suited men who had first appeared at his door, but by a formal letter slipped under it one morning. The paper was heavy, the kind rarely seen in his modest apartment, the family crest embossed in the corner. It requested, not demanded, his presence at a private meeting. He turned it over in his hand several times, uncertain whether to accept. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to remain in the safety of his anonymity, but another part knew this moment was inevitable. You do not save the son of a man whose name controlled industries without eventually being summoned to face him. The meeting was arranged in a downtown office tower that seemed to scrape the sky. He arrived in clothes as neat as he could manage, though they still bore the mark of years of use-faded fabric. Cuffs frayed from wear, shoes polished but dulled by time. As he stood in the gleaming lobby, surrounded by marble floors and glass walls, he felt the weight of contrast pressing down on him. The receptionist glanced at him once, doubt flickering in her eyes, before checking her list and confirming his name. He was led into an elevator that climbed smoothly upward, each floor passed, tightening the knot in his stomach. The room he was guided into was vast, yet restrained, its walls lined with books and framed photographs. A long table stretched across the center, polished to a sheen. At the far end stood a man who carried authority in every line of his posture, Victor Whitmore. His suit was immaculate, tailored so perfectly it seemed to belong only to him. His hair, silver at the temples, was combed with care. He turned as the janitor entered, his eyes sharp, assessing, carrying both fatigue and command. For a moment, neither spoke. The janitor stood just inside the doorway, unsure whether to approach further. Whitmore broke the silence, his voice measured but weighted. "You are the one who pulled my son from the car," was not quite a question, more a statement of fact. Yet disbelief tinged the edges of his tone. "Yes," the janitor replied quietly, his voice rougher than usual, the word feeling small against the expanse of the room. Whitmore studied him, eyes narrowing as though trying to reconcile the figure before him with the act that had reached headlines. Here was not a soldier, not a professional rescuer, but a man in work-worn clothes, his hands still bearing faint traces of burns. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. At last Whitmore stepped forward, his movements deliberate. "I have wealth, influence, men who are paid to guard my family," he said slowly. "And yet it was you, a stranger, who stepped forward when everyone else froze." The janitor shifted uncomfortably, resisting the weight of those words. "I didn't think about it." He was trapped. There wasn't time. Whitmore's gaze did not soften, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of humanity beneath the steel. "You risked your life for mine. That is not something I can accept lightly." "I didn't do it for you," the janitor said before he could stop himself. The words hung between them, blunt and honest. He lowered his eyes briefly, then added, "I did it because he needed help. That's all." Whitmore was silent again, the faintest trace of surprise crossing his features. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Perhaps that makes it even more extraordinary." The janitor looked at him then, meeting the sharp gaze directly. He saw not just the billionaire whose name filled newspapers, but a father grappling with the fragility of nearly losing his son, Gratitude flickered in those eyes, tempered by disbelief that someone with so little had done so much. For the first time, the gulf between wealth and work-worn clothes seemed to narrow, not through shared status, but through the simple fact of humanity. They spoke for a while longer, Whitmore asking careful questions about the night of the accident, about what the janitor had seen, about whether his son had spoken before slipping into unconsciousness. The janitor answered with quiet honesty, never embellishing. Each response seemed to disarm Whitmore further, as though the absence of self-interest was more startling than the rescue itself. When the conversation ended, Whitmore extended his hand. The janitor hesitated, then accepted. The billionaire's grip was firm, steady, the kind of handshake that carried history. "I owe you more than words can cover," Whitmore said. The janitor shook his head slightly. "You don't owe me anything. Just make sure he's all right." Whitmore's expression tightened, his voice softer now. "He will be, because of you." As the janitor left the towering office building, stepping back onto the busy city street, he carried with him a strange heaviness. The meeting had not brought closure, nor had it placed him at ease. Instead, it had opened a door he had never asked to walk through. A connection between two men whose lives should never have intersected. And though unease lingered, so too did the faint beginning of something neither of them had expected. Bond forged, not in wealth or recognition, but in fire, fear, and survival. The conversation with Victor Whitmore did not end in the polished room where their hands met. It lingered, carried into the janitor's thoughts long after he stepped back into the crowded street. The questions the billionaire had asked, simple on the surface, carried edges that cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Questions about why he had been there, why he had acted when others hadn't, what had pushed him forward in that moment of fire. They were not meant as accusations, but they carried a weight that forced him to look inward. And in doing so, old memories stirred, ones he usually kept buried beneath layers of routine and silence. That night, back in his small apartment, he sat by the window with the lights off, the city's glow spilling faintly through the glass. The words replayed in his head. Why you? It was the kind of question he had asked himself many times, but never with such intensity. He thought back to the years when opportunities seemed to appear for everyone else but him. There had been a time he had nearly landed an apprenticeship, working under a mechanic who promised to teach him a trade that might lead to something steady. He remembered the pride of being called in for an interview, the way he had rehearsed answers, the way his wife had ironed his only decent shirt. But on the morning of the meeting, his father collapsed at home, and he was forced to spend the day in a waiting room at the hospital. By the time he called, the position had been filled. There were other near misses, strung together like beads on a thread. The factory job he had lined up lost when the plant shut down suddenly before his first day. The construction work he abandoned when his wife's illness worsened and the shifts stretched too far into the night. Each time he told himself it was only a detour, that life would circle back with another chance. But years passed, and each detour became the road itself. What remained was janitorial work, honest, necessary but invisible. He learned to keep his head down, to accept that the world did not pause for him. He did not wait for his chance to rise. Whitmore's questions had pressed those truths against him with new force. Here was a man whose life had been carved in stone before he was even born, the son of fortune, the inheritor of empires. Their meeting had been like looking into a mirror that reflected not his own face, not the image of what life might have been if the road had bent differently. The contrast gnawed at him. He, in his worn jacket, skin roughened from years of scrubbing floors, Whitmore in his tailored suit, his voice commanding, his presence filling every room. Two men standing together, bound by an act of fire, yet separated by the vast gulf of circumstance. What unsettled him most was not envy, though a faint shadow of it lingered. It was the realization of how invisible he had become even to himself. For years he had accepted that role, fading into corners, blending into the background. But Whitmore had looked directly at him, had asked questions that cut through the disguise of invisibility. It forced him to confront the life he had lived and the quiet pain of being overlooked. Not because he was incapable, but because life had marked him as expendable, his potential swallowed by responsibilities and accidents of timing. He sat there in the dark, Wrestling with these thoughts, remembering the way Whitmore's gaze had carried both gratitude and disbelief. Gratitude for the life of his son, disbelief that such a rescue had come from someone like him. The unspoken part of that look stayed with him. How could someone invisible step forward when it mattered most? That question echoed louder than the sirens had, louder than the fire itself. It made him wonder if perhaps all his years of being dismissed had hardened something inside him. A quiet resilience that had carried him through smoke and flame without hesitation. Still, the divide between them was undeniable. Whitmore's wealth had built him walls of safety, armies of employees, a life where obstacles could be bought away. The janitor had lived where luck decided more than choice, where survival came not from wealth, but from enduring what came. They were opposites in every way, one commanding the world's notice, the other slipping beneath it. Yet fate had collided their paths in one brutal moment, binding them together in ways that defied explanation. As the night stretched on, he rubbed at the raw skin of his hands and thought of the fire, of the face of the young man he had dragged from death. He thought too of Whitmore's questions and how they had stirred wounds he had long learned to carry in silence. For the first time in years, he felt the ache of those wounds fully, not hidden under routine, but exposed by another man's disbelief. And though he did not yet know it, those questions would not fade. They would follow him, forcing him to measure his life not by the shadows he had lived in, but by the fire he had stepped into, and by the gaze of a billionaire who had seen him, truly seen him. If only for the first time, news of the young man's recovery reached him not through headlines this time, but through a quiet phone call. One of the Whitmore representatives, their voice softened from its usual crisp professionalism, told him that Andrew had regained consciousness. The words settled into him like a weight, heavy yet strangely relieving. For days he had wondered if the stranger he had pulled from the wreck had even survived beyond the hospital doors. Whether the effort and pain he had endured had given more than a few borrowed breaths. To know the man lived, to know the fragile rhythm of his chest had strengthened into something steady, filled him with a quiet sense of completion. Still, he did not expect more than that knowledge. Yet the recovery was not smooth. The news reports that filtered through painted a picture of slow progress, broken bones being set, of burns treated, of lungs clearing of smoke. He read none of it directly, but coworkers and neighbors whispered it in his direction. Watching his face for a reaction he seldom gave. Each update reminded him that survival was not a single moment of rescue, but a long series of battles fought in sterile hospital rooms. He remembered the weight of the man's body dragging against him, the slack face turned upward toward the smoke. And he wondered what thoughts would greet someone awakening from such a place. Gratitude, confusion, resentment at being spared. The call came again, a few days later. This time the voice was less formal, more human. Andrew wanted to meet him. He had asked for the man who had pulled him from the fire, insisted on it, even when doctors urged him to rest. The request unsettled him more than the billionaire's invitation ever had. He could picture Whitmore Sr. demanding such a meeting out of duty or image. But the son's request carried something different, personal, vulnerable. He hesitated before agreeing, his silence stretching long enough that the man on the other end gently asked if he was still there. Finally, he gave a quiet yes. The hospital was a place he had visited many times in his life, but never as a guest of a family such as this. He walked its halls with the same cautious step he had taken through offices, blending into the background even as nurses directed him toward the private wing where Andrew was kept. Security men stood by the door, their posture alert but not hostile. They checked his name against a list before ushering him in. The room was bright, sunlight spilling across white sheets and polished machines. Andrew lay propped against pillows, pale but alert, his face thinner than the photographs he had seen in the papers. A bandage covered part of his temple, and his arms bore faint marks of injury. But his eyes were sharp, alive, and focused directly on him the moment he entered. For a long moment, neither spoke. The janitor remained near the door, uncomfortable in the pristine space, while Andrew studied him with an intensity that was both grateful and searching. Finally, the young man broke the silence, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're the one," was not a question, but a statement, spoken with the weight of certainty. The janitor nodded once, unsure how else to respond. Andrew motioned weakly for him to come closer. He hesitated, then stepped forward, each footfall sounding too loud against the sterile floor. Standing beside the bed, he felt the same contrast as he had with the father, his worn jacket against the crisp white sheets. His roughened hands beside the bandaged but well-kept skin of a man born into wealth. Yet the difference felt less imposing here, softened by the vulnerability of someone who had nearly been lost. "I don't remember much," Andrew admitted, his gaze drifting toward the window before returning. "Smoke, heat, then nothing. They told me you pulled me out, that you went back when no one else did." His voice broke slightly, the words raw with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." The janitor shifted, uneasy under the weight of gratitude. "You don't need to," he said quietly. "You're alive. That's enough." But Andrew shook his head weakly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, it's not enough. You changed everything. If you hadn't been there—" His words trailed off, the unfinished thought heavy in the room. He swallowed, eyes glistening. "I want to know you. Not just as the man who saved me, but as a person. I can't let this end with a handshake and a headline." The janitor felt the urge to retreat, to fold back into the shadows where he belonged. Yet something in Andrew's voice anchored him, a sincerity that stripped away the divide of wealth and status. This was not the air of an empire speaking, not the subject of headlines, but a young man confronting the fragility of his own life. For the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to meet the eyes of the one he had carried from the wreck, and in that meeting, something unspoken passed between them. He left the hospital room after only a short visit, unwilling to linger, but as he walked back into the noise of the city, he carried with him more than the knowledge of survival. He carried the weight of connection, fragile but real, between two lives that had intersected in fire and were now bound by gratitude neither could fully name. The offer came with all the weight and polish of wealth. It was presented not in the language of sentiment, but in carefully measured words spoken across a desk so vast it seemed to swallow the silence between them. The billionaire leaned forward, his expression one of earnestness. But the air around him carried the authority of someone who was used to making decisions that changed lives. He spoke of gratitude, of debts that could not be left unsettled, and then laid out the terms as though they were part of a contract, a sum of money that would outstrip anything the janitor could earn in his lifetime. The keys to a house far beyond the crumbling apartment he called home. The promise of opportunities for his children should he accept. The janitor listened quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the polished floor rather than the man in the suit. Each word pressed down on him, not as a gift, but as a burden. To be handed something so immense, so unearned, felt to him like being bought, his active instinct and courage reduced to a transaction. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable in the tailored office, where even the air smelled different, filtered and faintly perfumed with something foreign. The thought of walking into that apartment with his name suddenly attached. Two riches made his chest tighten rather than ease. The billionaire mistook his silence for hesitation over scale, and began to explain further, listing practicalities. The money could secure his family's future. The house would remove him from the cycle of rent and repairs. The opportunities could grant his children an education he never dreamed of affording. It was all sensible, all logical, and yet it rang hollow to the man across from him. He thought of the mop in his hand every morning, the rhythm of labor that, though invisible, was his. He thought of the dignity he clung to, fragile and unspoken, in a life that had never given him much beyond survival. To accept the offer without question felt like surrendering that dignity, like letting someone else write the meaning of his choice on the street that day. Finally, he raised his eyes. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said quietly, the words landing more heavily than he intended. "I didn't go into that fire thinking someone would pay me for it." His voice was steady, but beneath it lay a storm of conflict, gratitude colliding with pride, humility resisting the shadow of obligation. He wanted to make it clear that his action was not a currency to be spent, not something that could be wrapped in wealth and tied with a bow. The billionaire frowned, not in anger but in confusion. He was a man accustomed to gratitude expressed in measurable terms, to people who accepted his gestures of generosity as unquestionable blessings. To face resistance here, from a man in work-worn clothes with calloused hands, unsettled him. He pressed again, his tone softening. "This isn't charity. It's respect. You risked everything for my son. Let me give something back." But the janitor shook his head slowly, his expression almost apologetic. "Respect isn't money. Respect is seeing me as a man, not as someone you can lift or shape with what you have." The words felt strange on his tongue, more direct than he was used to, but necessary. He could not leave the room without making the line clear that he had acted out of instinct, not need, and that to accept wealth without hesitation would change how he saw himself. The room fell quiet after that. The billionaire leaned back, studying him. The offer still on the table between them like a gulf neither could cross without altering something essential. The janitor's chest felt tight with the weight of refusing what any rational man would accept, yet he also felt something fierce within him, a flame of defiance that reminded him of who he was. Pride was a difficult companion, often heavy, often unyielding. But it was the one thing he had carried through every unnoticed day of his life. When he finally rose from his chair, the offer remained unclaimed. He thanked the man with a nod, his voice steady but subdued. "I'm glad your son is alive. That's enough for me." And with that, he turned toward the door, his back straight even as his heart wrestled with the enormity of what he had walked away from. Outside, the city noise felt raw and grounding, reminding him that his life was still his own. Yet the memory of that desk, of the weight of what had been laid before him, would linger. It was not the gift that haunted him, but the knowledge that some things, pride, dignity, the meaning of a choice, were worth more to him than all the wealth in the world. It began quietly at first, like the faint ripples that spread across a pond after a stone is thrown. A nod from a coworker who never before lifted his eyes when passing him in the hallway. A softened tone from the supervisor who once barked orders without hesitation. Small gestures, easy to overlook, but noticeable to a man who had lived most of his life on the margins of other people's attention. The whispers grew louder, the glances more deliberate. Soon, there was no mistaking it, something had shifted. At work, the janitor's presence carried a weight it had never known. The people who used to walk past him without so much as a glance now paused to greet him, sometimes offering awkward thanks, as though they themselves owed him something for what he had done. His mop, once a symbol of invisibility, became a prop in conversations whispered between desks. "That's him," someone would murmur when he passed, and heads would turn, eyes lingering with a mixture of respect and curiosity. For years, his value had been measured in polished floors and emptied trash bins. But now it seemed his worth had been recalculated in an instant. The recognition was not limited to the workplace. In the narrow hallways of his apartment building, neighbors who had lived beside him for years but scarcely knew his name now lingered in doorways, eager to exchange pleasantries. One brought him a plate of food with a nervous smile, insisting it was the least they could do. Another asked, clumsily, if he would tell the story again. Their children peering from behind their legs with wide eyes as though he were a figure from a tale. The janitor accepted their words with polite nods, his responses brief, careful. He did not want to feed the fire of attention, yet he could not extinguish it either. Not all reactions were warm. Admiration traveled hand in hand with envy. In the local store, he caught the sharp edge of muttered remarks, accusations that he was exaggerating, that he had stumbled into luck rather than courage, that saving a life did not make a man more deserving than anyone else. A neighbor's stare lingered too long, laced with something closer to resentment than respect. His sudden shift from anonymity to reluctant recognition unsettled the balance of things, and not everyone welcomed it. The change weighed heavily on him. Where once he had moved through the world unseen, now every step seemed observed. Privacy slipped from his grasp in ways he had never expected. A trip to the laundromat became a gauntlet of glances. The quiet bus ride home was interrupted by strangers approaching him, asking if he was the one. Each interaction left him conflicted. torn between humility and the uncomfortable realization that people who once ignored him were now constructing new versions of who he was, each based on fragments of a single moment at night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his modest apartment, replaying the crash and the fire not as triumph but as memory. The gratitude of some and the envy of others pressed against him with equal force, neither of them feeling entirely real. He wondered whether recognition was ever as generous as it appeared or whether it always carried shadows. It struck him that people admired not just what he had done, but what they imagined it meant. In their eyes, he had become something larger than himself, and yet inside, he felt unchanged, still the man who rose in darkness, swept the floors, and moved quietly through days no one remembered. The paradox was inescapable. He had wanted so little from the world, only to be left alone with his routine. And now the very invisibility he had carried like a cloak was gone. His coworkers treated him with a new respect, but their tones carried a distance, as if he had stepped into another category of man entirely. His neighbors offered gestures of kindness, but their eyes carried questions he could not answer. Even strangers reached for him, hoping to touch the edge of a story they could retell. He could not decide which unsettled him more, the admiration that felt undeserved or the envy that felt unfair. Both distorted him, reshaping his place in the world without his consent. What he longed for was the quiet he once resented, the ability to pass unnoticed, to exist without the constant reminder of what he had done. Yet he knew that ripple could not be reversed. The stone had been cast, and its circles spread wider each day, carrying him into a role he had never chosen, forcing him to see that even a single act could change not only how others viewed him, but how he viewed himself. The offer did not arrive with fanfare. It was not spoken beneath the glare of television lights or shouted across headlines. It came quietly, in a room that smelled faintly of polished wood and leather, where the billionaire sat across from him with the same unshakable composure that seemed to define every movement. The janitor had expected another expression of thanks, perhaps a second attempt to press money into his hands, but instead the words carried a weight he could not have anticipated. It was not a gift, the man explained. It was an opportunity, a place within his company, not as the one who cleaned offices when they were empty, but as someone entrusted with responsibilities that matched the honesty and courage he had displayed when he walked into fire. The janitor sat frozen, the words hanging in the space between them. For a moment he thought he had misheard. He had lived most of his life assuming that men like this one, the kind who wore tailored suits and spoke of assets and markets with ease, occupied a different world entirely. To be invited into it felt less like a door opening and more like stepping into a place where he did not belong. He tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by disbelief. The billionaire, watching him closely, continued without pause. He spoke of trust, of integrity, of the rare kind of courage that had nothing to do with wealth or power. He admitted that money could buy almost anything: comfort, security, prestige, but not the instinct to risk everything for a stranger. That, he said, was what his company needed more than another strategist or investor. It needed someone who carried that rare kind of moral clarity. The janitor shifted uneasily in his chair, listening, unsure if the words were meant for him or for some ideal version of him that existed only in the billionaire's imagination. Memories rose unbidden. Long shifts spent scrubbing floors until his knees ached. Nights when he counted out coins at the kitchen table, wondering how to stretch them until payday. The looks of pity or dismissal from people who barely saw him. His life had been built on routine, not ambition. And now ambition was being laid at his feet like a mantle he had never asked to carry. He thought of the mop, the broom, the bucket of soapy water that had been his companions for years. He thought of how safe invisibility could feel, how the shadows had protected him from disappointment. What would it mean to step out of them now? The silence grew heavy. The janitor finally asked the only question that made sense to him. Why him? There were men with degrees, with polished shoes and confident smiles, who had trained their whole lives for positions inside companies like this. He had nothing but calloused hands and a reputation for being the man no one noticed until the floors gleamed. The billionaire's reply was simple. Those men could be found anywhere. A man who would risk his life without hesitation, not for reward, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That was rare. That was worth more than experience. The words stirred something within him, but so did doubt. He wondered if the offer was another form of charity, dressed in finer clothes. He wondered if stepping into this world would mean losing the independence he had guarded so carefully. It's the right to shape his own path, even if it was narrow. Pride and humility wrestled within him, pulling in opposite directions. The offer felt like both a gift and a burden, a promise and a trap. As the conversation ended, the janitor found himself standing at a crossroads he had never imagined. One path led back to the life he knew, quiet, hidden, reliable in its routines. The other stretched into unfamiliar territory, a place where he might be seen, where expectations would rise around him like walls he was not sure he could climb. He left the room with the weight of the choice pressing against his chest, the sound of the billionaire's voice echoing in his mind. It was not money this time. It was not a reward he could politely refuse. It was something deeper, a chance to reshape the very story of his life. And for the first time in years, he realized he could not simply walk away without considering what it might mean to accept. The morning still began the same way. His alarm clock buzzed at 5, the same shrill note that had dictated his life for years, and he rose with the instinct of habit. His boots waited by the door, scuffed and worn at the toes, carrying the marks of countless nights spent pushing carts down long hallways. He still reached for the thermos his daughter had given him one Christmas, still filled it with the same bitter coffee, still walked out into streets that had not changed. Yet everything else around him was shifting. He carried with him the memory of the office he had been shown, the quiet hum of a place where the floors were spotless, not because of him, but because others were paid to keep them that way. He had sat in a chair that cost more than his rent, at a table where men spoke in clipped sentences about millions, as though the numbers were pebbles to be tossed aside. That image clung to him, sharp and insistent. Each time he tightened the straps on his gloves and wheeled his mop, bucket forward, the division between the two lives gnawed at him. One moment he was crouched beside a toilet, scrubbing stains that no one else wanted to look at. The next, he was remembering the weight of the billionaire's gaze, the strange respect that had been offered to him, as though he had earned a place at a table he had never dreamed of approaching. He tried to brush it off, to bury himself in the rhythm of his old work, but the contrast refused to let him go. The mop sloshing through dirty water became a reminder of what he had always been. The gleam of the boardroom became a reminder of what he could be. If he dared to step into it, his coworkers noticed the change before he admitted it to himself. They saw the way he moved with a distracted air, the way his eyes seemed elsewhere even as his hands moved through the familiar motions. Some whispered that he was restless. Others joked that he was thinking of greener pastures. He let the comments wash over him without reply, though each one cut deeper than he cared to admit. It was true. He was restless. He was unsettled. For years he had carried the cloak of invisibility as though it were protection. Now it felt heavy, suffocating, like a disguise that no longer fit. At night, the struggle deepened. He would sit at the kitchen table long after the dishes were cleared, staring at the faint lines etched into the wood. His children had done their homework there, his wife had paid bills there, and he had counted every last coin on that surface when times were lean. That table represented survival, the small victories of a man who had accepted his place in the world and learned to endure. And yet, against that backdrop, the image of the boardroom intruded like an intruder in his home. It spoke of possibilities, of doors opening into places he had never been welcome, of a chance to be more than the man who passed unseen in the hallways. The conflict grew sharper each day. He could not ignore the dignity of his old life, the quiet pride of work done well, even if no one noticed. There was honor in keeping spaces clean, in labor that others overlooked. But he also could not ignore the temptation of the new life being dangled before him. A life where his voice might carry weight, where decisions he made might ripple far beyond a freshly mopped floor. He began to feel as though he were straddling two worlds, each demanding his loyalty, each whispering of costs and rewards he could not yet measure. Even the smallest details became reminders of the divide. The uniform he wore, with its name tag sewn slightly crooked, felt like a tether to the past. The pressed suits he had glimpsed in the offices felt like a uniform of another kind, one that carried power instead of humility. He imagined himself in one of them, and then recoiled, as though even picturing it was an act of betrayal. He was not ready to decide. But the decision pressed closer with each passing day. The silence of the night offered no comfort. Lying awake, he replayed the billionaire's words again and again. Words about trust, about integrity, about needing someone who understood sacrifice. They sounded noble, but they also sounded like chains disguised as gifts. Could he step into that world without losing the essence of who he was? Could he accept the offer without surrendering to it? Between two worlds, he walked a narrow line, torn between the safety of the shadows and the unsteady brightness of the unknown. Each step forward seemed to pull him deeper into the conflict. And yet he knew there would come a day when standing still would no longer be possible. The mop and the boardroom seat both waited for him. And whichever he chose would shape not just his life, but the way he would be remembered the first weeks inside. The new circle were heavy with silence and glances that spoke more than words. He walked into rooms where conversations stalled mid-sentence, eyes sliding over him with the faintest hint of dismissal. Men and women in polished suits carried themselves with practiced ease. Their voices measured, their gestures deliberate, as though rehearsed for a stage he had never set foot on. He sat among them in shirts that bore the creases of work, shoes that had been shined as best as he could manage, but still betrayed years of wear. The contrast was impossible to hide. To some, his presence was an oddity, a story they had been forced to live with because of their employer's gratitude, but not something they accepted willingly. Whispers found their way to him. They were rarely direct, almost always slipping between the cracks of casual remarks. A secretary lowering her voice as he passed, murmuring about a janitor in the boardroom. An executive who left papers stacked in a way that made it clear he wasn't expected to touch them. The smiles that met him in public meetings often faltered the moment backs were turned. He was being measured, weighed against standards he had never been asked to meet before. And more often than not, he felt the scales tilting against him. The billionaire himself spoke of trust, of integrity, of the value of courage that had been proven in fire and smoke. Yet the circle around him did not share that view. To them, trust was not won by a single act of bravery, but by pedigree. Education, connections carefully built over years in the right places, he had none of those. What he carried instead was the memory of heat on his skin, smell of burning gasoline, the strength it took to pull a life from danger. But those experiences left no marks that could be paraded in meetings or entered into resumes. To some, he was not an equal, but a reminder of something they would rather not acknowledge. That worth could exist outside the walls of wealth and privilege. The subtle opposition grew sharper with time. A manager left him out of an important briefing, only to claim it was an oversight. A junior associate handed him papers with a tone that sounded more like command than collaboration. In every hallway, in every conversation, there lingered the question of whether he belonged. He felt it pressing against him like a weight on his chest. He had spent years invisible, a man who moved silently and left no mark. Now he was too visible, scrutinized in ways that stripped away his quiet dignity. Still, he endured. Each task given to him, he completed with the same diligence that had carried him through long nights pushing a mop. He arrived early, stayed late, studied documents until his eyes blurred. He listened more than he spoke, letting words settle before offering his own. He had no illusions about being welcomed with open arms. What he did have was resilience, carved deep into him from years of labor no one saw. But the tests of trust did not end with cold shoulders. One evening, after a meeting that stretched late into the night, he overheard two executives speaking in a hallway. They spoke of him in clipped tones, questioning why the billionaire had chosen to place faith in someone who had lived his life in obscurity. One laughed softly, wondering how long before he stumbled, how long before he proved them right. The words stung, but they also steeled him. He understood then that he would not be judged by what he had already done, but by how long he could stand in the face of doubt. There were moments when he considered walking away, retreating back into the safety of routine. Life had been simpler in the shadows. Yet each time the thought arose, he He remembered the face of the young man he had pulled from fire, the gratitude that had flickered through pain. He remembered the offer of trust from the father, words that had carried both weight and risk. If he left now, it would not only abandon the chance given to him, but also confirm the doubts of those who never wanted him there, so he stayed. He absorbed the stares, the whispers, the small acts of exclusion, and carried them like he had carried so many unseen burdens before. The fire had tested his body. This new world was testing his spirit. Trust was not given freely here, not to him. But he was determined that if it was to be tested, it would not be found lacking. He had walked through smoke before. He would walk through this, even if it meant standing alone. The hospital room was quiet when the janitor stepped in, its walls painted in muted tones meant to soothe, but instead feeling sterile, almost hollow. Machines hummed steadily, their rhythms marking time more faithfully than any clock. The young man he had pulled from the burning wreck lay propped against white pillows, his face thinner now, color slowly returning, eyes clearer than they had been the last time they met. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence carried something heavy, as though both were trying to find words that could span the distance between them. It was the son who broke it first, his voice low, carrying the rasp of healing lungs. He thanked the janitor, not for the first time, but there was something different this time. Less automatic, less shaped by the expectations of gratitude. He looked down at his hands, fingers tracing the crease of the blanket, as though the truth he carried could only come out if his eyes were fixed elsewhere. He admitted that before the crash, his life had been unraveling. Nights spent in clubs where music drowned out thought, mornings blurred by the dull ache of hangovers, afternoons wasted in the pursuit of distractions that never satisfied. The car, the speed, the recklessness, it had all been a way to feel alive, to feel separate from the shadow of his father's empire. He said he had grown up with everything others envied: wealth, privilege, opportunity. Yet none of it felt earned. None of it felt his. The expectations that came with his last name weighed heavier than chains. Every achievement measured against a father who had built an empire with relentless drive. To escape it, he had chased moments of chaos. The crash wasn't an accident. Not really. It was the inevitable end of choices made, not for joy, but for defiance. His eyes lifted then, meeting the janitor's. Searching for judgment, but finding only stillness, the janitor listened without interruption. His face carried the same quiet composure it always did, the same steady patience that had seen him through years of labor and invisibility. He did not scold or excuse. He simply absorbed the words, letting them rest in the space between them. When the son faltered, the janitor's silence gave him room to continue. He confessed that being pulled from that burning car had been more than survival. It had been confrontation. In the searing heat and choking smoke, when his body had gone limp and his mind had hovered on the edge of nothing, someone had reached in and refused to let him go. That refusal had forced him to see himself differently. He could no longer dismiss his life as disposable when a stranger had nearly burned alive to keep it from ending. He said the janitor had saved more than his body. He had forced him to face the truth of the path he had been on, and the reality of what he might still become if he chose differently for the first time. His voice cracked, the words tumbling out with less control. He admitted he was afraid. Afraid of failing his father again. Afraid of trying to step into a life of purpose and finding himself incapable. He confessed that part of him wished the fire had ended things, because then he would never have to confront the weight of expectation. But the moment he looked into the janitor's face as he was dragged from the wreck, gasping for air while flames roared behind, he realized someone believed his life mattered enough to risk everything. That belief was something he had never felt before, not from crowds, it's not from family, not even from himself. The janitor did not rush to answer. He leaned back slightly, the smell of disinfectant lingering around them, the hum of machines filling the silence once more. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. He said that life was not about shadows or empires, not about proving worth to others. It was about surviving each day with integrity intact. He told the young man that he had been reckless, yes, but recklessness did not define the rest of his life unless he chose to let it. The fire had been a turning point, and whether it marked an end or a beginning, depended entirely on the choices he made now. The young man listened, eyes glistening, his breathing steady but fragile. He nodded slowly, as if the words were not yet fully understood, but deeply felt. In that quiet hospital room, the confession hung between them like smoke that refused to clear, heavy but cleansing. The son realized he had been given not just another chance to live, but another chance to live differently. The janitor, in his quiet way, had saved more than one life that day. He had saved a future the young man had nearly thrown away. The days after the confession carried a subtle shift, not marked by grand gestures, but by quiet moments that began to form a thread between three men who might never have crossed paths otherwise. The son, still recovering in the hospital, began to ask for the janitor's visits not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire to hear his voice. The father, at first, a distant figure whose presence filled rooms with authority, started arriving earlier than expected, sometimes finding the janitor already sitting by his son's bedside. What began as polite acknowledgement gradually grew into conversations that lingered long after the room had grown still. The son no longer spoke like someone who wanted to disappear into the noise of parties or the reckless blur of fast cars. His words carried a new weight, hesitant but searching, as though he were trying to rebuild a foundation that had always been cracked. The janitor, in turn, offered no lectures. Only stories drawn from a life that had known difficulty without luxury, responsibility without applause. He spoke of working nights so his children could have shoes without holes. He spoke of mornings that began in silence, sweeping corridors no one noticed, yet holding on to the belief that dignity was not something handed down from wealth, but carried inside. Each story seemed to land deeply with the son, who listened in ways he had never listened before. The father watched these exchanges with a kind of restrained wonder. He was a man who had spent decades surrounded by voices that measured worth in numbers and contracts. Rarely had he sat in a room where someone spoke with authority born not from money but from experience. At first, it unsettled him. Then, gradually, it drew him in. He began to ask his own questions, not about business or the world he had conquered, but about how the janitor managed to endure years of being unseen without bitterness consuming him. The answers were never complex. They were quiet, steady, and honest. The janitor admitted there were days when bitterness tried to take root, but he had always reminded himself that envy did not feed his family, anger did not pay the bills, and pride alone could not keep a roof over his children. Instead, he had chosen patience, even when the world seemed not to care. The son, listening to his father's questions, saw for the first time a humility in the man he had spent years resenting. It startled him to realize his father, with all his power, was searching for something just as much as he was. And the bridge between them, unexpectedly, was the man in work-worn clothes, who had dragged one out of fire and forced the other to see life in sharper relief. As days turned into weeks, the visits became less formal. The suits and ties disappeared. The conversations stretched longer, sometimes filled with laughter at small memories, sometimes marked by silences that spoke more than words. The son began to tell stories of his childhood not as complaints but as reflections, admitting where he had misunderstood his father's sternness as indifference. The father, in return, acknowledged moments where he had been so consumed with building his empire that he had failed to notice the cost at home. The janitor did not mediate these confessions, but his presence made them possible. His quiet steadiness was a kind of anchor, reminding both father and son that honesty did not have to shatter bonds, but could, instead, strengthen them. What grew between them was not friendship in the usual sense, nor family in the literal sense. It was something rarer, forged in the heat of fire and the vulnerability of survival. It was respect that did not depend on wealth, admiration that did not rely on titles. The janitor, who had spent a lifetime overlooked, became the measure of a new standard neither father nor son had known they needed. Humility, courage, and character became the common ground where they could all stand. There were no cameras in these moments, no headlines to capture them. The world outside still whispered about the billionaire's son pulled from flames, the hero janitor, the strange turn of fate. But inside quiet rooms, far from the noise, 3 men were piecing together something much more lasting. They were discovering that wealth could not buy what had been born from fire: trust, gratitude, and a bond beyond measure. And though none of them said it aloud, each knew it was something they would carry long after the ash and smoke had faded into memory. The city moved on quickly, as it always did, but the man at the center of it all found himself returning to the rhythms that had once defined his life. The mops still moved across tiled floors, the buckets still sloshed, and the quiet hallways of the building echoed with the same steady scrape of his labor. To anyone passing through, it might have seemed nothing had changed. The janitor remained the same figure in worn shoes and faded clothes, pushing through shadows while others hurried to brighter places. Yet something beneath the surface had shifted, something that could not be seen in his posture or his uniform, but lingered in the way he carried silence differently now. He no longer thought of himself as invisible, even if the world still looked past him most days. The echo of flames remained, a reminder not just of what he had done, but of the choice he had made when no one else stepped forward. It had not been strength or training that guided him, but a decision born in an instant, the refusal to watch someone perish when he could act. That moment lived inside him, replayed not with grandeur but with the quiet recognition that courage often hides in the smallest, simplest gestures. Neighbors greeted him now with longer glances, sometimes hesitant smiles, sometimes words they might never have spoken before. Coworkers paused in their routines, treating him with a cautious respect, as though the mop in his hand was no longer just a tool of labor, but a symbol of something greater. It unsettled him at times, this shift in perception, because he had never sought it. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been given no real choice but to act, because to stand still would have betrayed something essential inside him. And so he returned to his tasks, grounding himself in the familiarity of work, knowing that recognition fades, but the habit of endurance remains. The father and son appeared now and again, sometimes in person, sometimes in messages passed through others. Their bond, fragile at first, had deepened in the weeks after the fire, and he could see in their faces a weight lifted, as though flames had burned away not only danger, but the walls that had long stood between them. They thanked him still, though he waved it off each time. He did not need gratitude to know he had mattered. The truth was simpler. He had stepped forward when others had stepped back, and that was enough. At night, when the city quieted, he thought of the randomness of it all. How many times had he walked that same road, past that same corner, without incident? How thin was the line between ordinary routine and extraordinary change? It humbled him to realize that a life could be rewritten not by design but by accident, by being present in the wrong place at the right time. He wondered, sometimes, what might have happened had he hesitated even a few seconds longer. The thought unsettled him, yet also reminded him of the fragile weight every decision carries in the quiet of his own home. Where bills still stacked and the fridge still hummed with its uneven rhythm, he understood that the world had not transformed him into something else. He was still the man who rose before dawn, still the man who wiped away the dust no one wanted to see. But he was also something more now, even if only to himself. He had proof that invisibility did not mean insignificance. That worth was not measured by wealth or position, but by the willingness to act when action was needed most. He carried no medals, no photographs framed on walls. What he carried instead was memory, the searing heat on his arms, the choking smoke in his lungs, the weight of another life dragged free of fire. Those sensations did not fade, but neither did the quiet satisfaction that followed. The world might remember him for a season, then forget, but he would remember himself differently forever, and so the janitor returned to his routine. But the routine no longer hid everything. It revealed something. Instead, that even the most overlooked life could hold the power to alter others in ways that would echo for years. He needed no reminder of that fact, no public honor. The truth was enough. In a moment when the world froze, he stepped forward. That single choice had written itself across more than his own life, and though the flames had long since died out, their echo followed him wherever he went, not as a burden, but as a quiet, enduring light.